don't believe so. I think we're just not right at 12.
Okay, we are going to get started. It's my pleasure to turn it over to the next moderator, Ezra Klein. I'm sure all of you read him regularly from the Washington Post. Ezra, thank you.
All right, good morning. Can you all hear me? Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming. It's an honor to be here chatting with all of you. I guess the way to begin this panel is to say simply that my fellow domestic policy wonks, the state of the labor market is completely screwed. And we're going to figure out sort of how to fix it. I'm always struck, actually, thinking about the labor market, because I remember back when the recession started, and you talk about different scenarios for unemployment, and people would say things like, oh, I mean, if unemployment is 8% in 2012, that's going to be like a Mad Max-style universe where people are going to be, you know, running with motorcycle gangs on the streets, and so we don't even need to worry about that. And yet, here we are. Things are really, really quite bad, and worse, there's an increasing sense that we are locking into the badness, that we are become resigned to this being what America looks like in the early part of the 20th century, that the good times were some kind of an illusion, that 6%, 6.5%, 5.5% unemployment was a bubble, that in this day, in this globalized age, in the information economy and whatever buzzwords you want to attach to it, that 7, 8% unemployment is for quite a while just what we're going to have. And, you know, we are just going to have to move our attention onto other issues like the budget deficit or the long-term skills gap. So my panel here is going to tell me whether or not that is true, which I'm excited to learn about. And I appreciate them all being here. We have great introductions, great long introductions for everybody in your book, but I'm going to do short ones here. We have Sarita Gupta, who is the Executive Director of Jobs for Justice. Thank you for being here. We have Harry Holzer from the Georgetown Public Policy Institute, and he's Associate Dean from 04 to 06, and also author of the book Good Jobs, which was terrific, and I recommend you all read. We have Heidi Shierholz from the Economic Policy Institute, whose graphs I rely on very, very heavily in my everyday life. And Eugene Steuerle from the Urban Institute, whose graphs I also rely on heavily in my everyday life. And so, Heidi, I actually want to begin with you. Are we in a new normal? How much of this now is essentially permanent, is locked into the labor market?
I think what we're doing now is our choice. It doesn't have to be like this. I think it is true, given the political realities, that this is where we're going to be for a while. But the economic realities are such that it doesn't have to be like this. We could take the steps to bring the unemployment rate down, to get jobs back. But the political reality seems to be that this is going to be where we are for 3-4 years. We're going to see this persistent high unemployment because Washington isn't willing to make the choices, the fiscal stimulus that we would need to bring the unemployment rate down. So it's not it's a near-term normal because we're choosing to make it that way.
Sarita, we talk about the sort of resignation in Washington and the degree to which we've chosen to allow this to become the new normal, at least for the time being. What is, on the state and local level, is there a similar level of fatalism? Are things as gridlocked and deadlocked and calcified there as they are here?
No, I wouldn't say they are on the state and local level, and thank God for that, actually. Really, what we're seeing is a lot of energy. People are frustrated and angry. I mean, when we look at the response from everyday people, everyday workers to what's really happening in the labor market today, it's a real indication that change is still possible, and people believe that, and that we need to nurture that. For example, you know, last summer 45,000 Verizon workers went on strike, and they're still in a brutal contract battle, but they went on strike to say we're going to hold the line on our wages and benefits. Or the thousands of workers that we see every day who take risks and are standing up in their workplaces for rights on the job. And I think people understand fundamentally there's a gridlock in DC, but there's opportunities at the state and local level, and it's going to take mobilizing, organizing at the state and local levels to really make a difference to influence what's happening in DC today.
Harry, to get out of the actual sort of practical and up into the abstract era of theory that appears to drive so much of what we do here, when I talk to folks about this, there appears to be a dawning or a narrative is kind of taking hold. And that narrative is actually that what came before the recession was an illusion. That what came before the recession was a kind of a falsely good economy in which we were protected from a increasingly eroding skills base and the competition of a globalizing economy by essentially a credit bubble. And so when the bubble popped, when the financial crisis came, what we were left with wasn't just the popping of a financial bubble, but also the reality that we had actually been living in without knowing it. And that, to me, is where a lot of this idea that these things are not as easily solvable as stimulus or other approaches would make it seem, because we're not just solving the short-term problem that we saw, but this longer problem that has been building for about a decade now, or even more than that. How do you see that? Were there long-term trends feeding into where we are now, or what we're seeing just the aftermath of a terrible financial bubble?
Yes, I think it's really important to separate what's the effect of the business cycle in the Great Recession, which has taken us a long time to get out of, and even if we had done the right thing, and we should have done the right thing, it would still be hard to get out of. Because I think when financial bubbles burst, there's a lot of evidence on this. The recovery is always slower. The cleanup is a lot messier. Keynesian policy can't solve all of that. It can solve some of it, and we could have done better. Separate from that, there are these long-term trends in the labor market. Technology, globalization. They do a lot of good things. They also hurt some people and displace some people, especially the less educated. But even people with college degrees can find themselves displaced. And what we saw in the last, if you look at the whole last cycle from 2000 to 2007, before the Great Recession hit, and even with the real estate bubble, the labor market wasn't all that great. Median earnings were pretty stagnant. At least in that time period, the gains were mostly going to the top 1%, although if you look at a longer time period before that, that's somewhat less true. You do have these long-term structural issues, partly reflecting skill issues. And of course, we're focused on the poor here. I think the poor in this kind of an economy where the institutions have weakened, the growth is weaker. I think more than ever, the skills gap is very important for those long-term problems. But yeah, there's a lot of problems. Even if we were to recover quickly from this recession, you have some long-term trends that are quite damaging to the poor and even to people closer to the middle of the labor market.
And Gene, what do we do about those problems? What do we do about the skills gap and the underlying long-term trends? Are these problems we can actually ameliorate? Because when I look at the evidence on some of this, I get just terribly, terribly depressed and tend to turn to drinking very, very quickly, because it looks, we know how to build a bridge. It often seems we have a lot more trouble figuring out, particularly in any kind of shorter term time horizon, how to move workers into sectors, how to train them for sectors that we think they would be better suited in.
Well, I'm a firm believer in what Herb Stein once called the I don't know school of economics, which means that I think most of us need to be pretty modest about what we know and what we don't know. But what I do think we know, which actually is, for me, a cause of optimism, is I do think we know a lot of things we should do. We don't know the perfect answers. We don't know absolutely whether program X or Y will work. But we do know, for instance, a lot of shifts we could make that would be a lot better. So let me actually contradict some things that was actually stated, at least in the last panel, at least a little bit. I don't think we're in an age of austerity at all. I think we are in an age in which, because of the recent financial recession, we haven't grown a lot in the last few years. And it may be that we're going to have slow growth for the next few years. But since when does an average household income, or GDP, of about $135,000 a household make us poor? Or since when does a government that on average federal government spends $30,000 just in direct spending? It's got about $10,000 per household in tax expenditures. State and local governments have another $10,000. Since when does a government that spend $50,000 per household on average, that's not means tested, that's just the average. Since when is that a poor society that can't do anything? What we've got is a society that allocates these resources, I think, very badly. And in particular, at times of recession, we don't actually come in and mainly help those who most need the help. Instead, we put the impact of a recession and the impact of these things on a very small portion of the population, whereas a lot of us, including a lot of people in this room, it's almost as if they're out there and we're in here and we bear hardly any of the burden. So I think there are a lot of things we can do. We don't know how to do them perfectly, but I think there are a lot of shifts that are possible to deal with this, to start moving to educate the young, very young, to start favoring work more within our welfare and our tax programs. And we could go on and on, but I think there are a lot of things we can do better.
Well, we actually have time in this panel, so I'm going to say we go on and on as a moderator. And I actually want to just go down to just, we have a long time, guys. You're here. The doors are locked. There's nowhere anybody's going. I actually want to go down the line and have each of you answer this question. Imagine this were like a very special episode of Oprah, and underneath each of your chairs was a check for $300 billion. Very, very special, as I mentioned. But you have to spend it on something in the economy. You have to spend it on something that you believe will help. Where do you spend $300 billion? And Heidi, we'll just begin with you and go right down.
I think right now the most important thing is to stop the hemorrhaging of public sector jobs. So in this moment, it's fiscal relief to states and localities that we could get rid of that money really fast and it would do the best good.
$300 billion?
I think, yeah.
Can
and
we
if
use
we
that
have
much
left over, we would do some additional investments in infrastructure. Like those are the top two that we should max out everything we can to shore up state and local budgets. The leftover we can put towards additional infrastructure investments.
Sarita?
I agree with getting money to the states and building out public sector jobs, but I would say the leftover, which I think we would have leftover, I would actually promote goes into the creation of what I'm calling care jobs in this country. With the mass demographic shifts that we heard about earlier, the other demographic shift that's happening is every 8 seconds someone is turning 65 in this country. And with medical advances, it means people are living longer. And what that means is there is a need and a desire for more home-based health care in this country. I think there's a huge opportunity for us today, right now, to create at least 2 million care jobs. And that will help get the economy going. It'll also ensure that millions of workers right now are able to access jobs, get the training and support that they need, and actually have increased labor standards in the sector that's desperately needed.
Harry.
So I have a question. Is this a one-time $300 billion check, or is it every year?
No. You've got this one time. I mean,
one time.
It's possible I'm going to give you another, but we'll see how the first one works out.
Well, then, if it's only one time, then I'm going to spend it mostly the way Heidi and Sarita did. One time, sort of get maximum bang for the buck on job creation, public sector jobs, public service jobs, infrastructure jobs. I would also reserve some of it for well-targeted tax credits for employers who are expanding payroll, a little bit along the lines of the Obama administration's proposal, but I think much better targeted. And that doesn't leave a lot of money for the long-term things. I'd rather spend that money on, expanding work supports to people who don't get them now, like low-income men paying child support as opposed to low-income moms with kids, and other kinds of supports of that nature, and education and job training too.
Gene?
If I've got to spend it now, I guess I got to say, well, we'll see. I would say I agree with the previous panelists. I'd spend it mainly on jobs, but I don't think that's where I would go. I would start investing in the long term. I think we've already gone through several years of trying to invest in the short term, and I think there are limits on how much we can do there. But just by way of contrast, we do this annual study of kids, what portion of the budget goes to kids. And we looked in the Obama budget, and about 10 years from now, basically the Obama budget said we'll spend $1 trillion more a year. Not $300 billion, $1 trillion more a year. Now if the Republicans win, maybe that's $800 billion. So there's growth in the economy. There's more to spend. It's all going either for interest on the debt, which is maybe $400 or $500 billion, or it's going to go for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for without the kids being included. That's where it's all going. I would start trying to figure out whether it's your $300 billion or that trillion. I would start trying to figure out how to spend it more on the young, on the kids, on investment, on infrastructure, on early childhood education, and all these things that we need to start doing, and start moving permanently towards solving some of these long-term problems, and quit always trying to focus on the short term, because the short-term problems are always going to be with us, and we can always put off the long-term for the long term.
So then let me ask you a variant of that question, which may get more at what you're saying here. Let's say you don't have money. What you have is the federal government's regulatory and executive apparatus. You have cabinet agencies, you can write rules, you can change congressional procedure. Are there things we could do in this country right now that aren't related to spending a lot of money that would be significant for the labor market? Are there directions we could go in that possibly are not simply direct hiring, but somehow would change the ecosystem which job creation is happening right now?
It's a good question, and you're right. There's huge political obstacles towards doing anything that costs a lot of money. The problem is there's also huge political obstacles to anything else we would want to try, but they're out there, right? We need to raise the minimum wage. The minimum wage is 20% below where it was in real terms in the late 60s. Making it easier for workers who want to join a union to join a union. Like there's a bunch of stuff that we can. I'm not used to being in rooms like this, where we can. But there's plenty of stuff that we can do that won't actually cost any money. The political realities that we're pushing up against are sort of the same that we are in getting immediate job creation. So it's a tricky scene.
I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, to me, ensuring that workers have organizing collective bargaining rights in this country is a huge step forward, because we know if workers don't have union jobs, we know wages decline. And this is a conference on poverty. We see more and more workers falling into poverty. We need to change that. So being able to pass policy like the Employee Free Choice Act that many of us attempted to have passed many years ago around real labor law reform in this country is critical. I do think that there are, I just want to make a point for a second to the long-term investment piece that you raised, because I do feel like there are two sectors in this country that are the fastest growing sectors when it comes to job growth. One is retail, and the other is the care economy, or care jobs. And when I look at retail even, it doesn't have to cost money. We need to change some of the business models that are out there that currently promote the stripping away of wages, the constant subcontracting of workers, the busting of unions, that are really having huge implications on a broader spectrum of our economy. So if you look at Walmart, for example, and you look at the Walmart economy, it doesn't work for people. It just doesn't work for people. And if we could change the business model of a company like Walmart and the way that it operates in our economy, it would not only have huge implications on Walmart associates that are employed by Walmart, but it would have implications for logistics workers, warehouse workers, supply chain workers in our economy, all low-wage workers. But fundamentally, that doesn't cost us more money. It's about us actually standing up and saying to private employers like Walmart that you've got to change your business model in order to make sure that this economy, you're promoting an economy that works for people.
So it's time to, I got to put on my mainstream economist hat, and I'm reluctant to do this in this room because it could cost me my life before I make it to the door. Given the support, I think, and I support and have supported the Employee Free Choice Act, and I support periodic increases in the minimum wage. I don't believe in the kinds of very competitive markets that now characterize the 21st century that we're going to regulate and organize our way out of this problem. Those things can help, and I support those things. But we, as progressives, we have to be honest about the changes in labor markets, the changes in product markets. Raising wages, workers' wages, without raising their productivity, raises costs to employer, raises prices. Employers, compared to 50 years ago, have so many ways to avoid high-priced labor that they didn't have when Michael Harrington wrote his book. The world is really different. Those markets work. And consumers. Consumers aren't going to put up with high prices on goods and services driven up by high wages when they have many options. Consumers can go on the internet now all over the world and buy products that they used to have to buy locally. The world is different. The economy is different. That doesn't mean we don't do some of these things. Again, I would not raise the minimum wage today or tomorrow. When you have 8% unemployment, I wouldn't raise. I would wait. I thought it was more than overdue when we raised them in 2007 to 2009. I would wait at least a few more years before doing it again when labor markets are this soft, because there's a lot of research evidence on this. Some of it says minimum wages have no effect on employment. Even more good studies say there's some modest effect. I just don't think, and I think, by the way, if anybody loses their job from raising the minimum wage, it's more likely to be a poor adult than a middle-class teenager or a middle-class homemaker that constitute about 80% of the people working at the minimum wage. So let's be honest about some of these constraints. Let's have an honest discussion. That doesn't mean you don't do these things, but look at the competitiveness of the labor market. We're in a very different world. We have to raise the productivity a lot of workers at the bottom, as well as just their wages and benefits. And let's think about, what are the changes in education and training? How can you help the high road employers? How do you incent them? Do you just beat them over the head with unionization and these other threats? Or are there other carrots and incentives to help employers go that high road to invest more in the skills of their employees? And I think to me, that's a framing of the issue. It's not just bashing employers. I don't know how you're ever going to change Walmart to change its business model in this world. We have to accept the competitive realities and think of how to work with companies and workers in that context.
But I don't think you have to bash employers over the head. That's not what I'm certainly not suggesting. And if you look at the campaign, the Making Change at Walmart campaign, it's not about bashing Walmart. It is about saying, you are a leader in our economy. You can do better. We know you can do better. And we saw evidence of it this past weekend. I don't know if people have been following this case of these workers who are in, I'm going to say this wrong, Brobridge, Louisiana, who are crawfish workers, seafood workers. They're basically brought in, they're guest workers brought in 4 months out of a year to basically peel crawfish. They're the sole supplier for Walmart. It's been found that they are in forced labor situations. They're not even paid the minimum wage. Their families are being threatened in Mexico because they're standing up to their employer, who is actually standing up to Walmart and saying, you are pinching us so much as small businesses that it's forcing us to push forward a business model that squeezes and squeezes and squeezes the workers in such a way that it ultimately is not sustainable. And that's about us standing up together as a country and a nation and saying, all right, how do we change this business model? It doesn't have to be this way. And that doesn't require bashing Walmart over the head, but it requires a real discussion.
But it requires having productive workers to offset any higher costs you want it.
But your assumption is these workers aren't productive. These workers are working 22 hours a day. And there's evidence of that.
Employers will choose their most effective and efficient way of producing it. And if they think they can get it cheaper overseas, they're going to do that. And there's not going to be the mechanism to block that.
But are we as a nation saying that's okay? That's all right, that workers should work 22 hours a day?
No, of course not. We have labor laws in place that have to be enforced. We all agree on that.
To jump in as moderator here, there's a very big difference between not enslaving crawfish workers.
But these are low-wage jobs, right?
I mean, from what you're saying, they're worse than that. I mean, we're dealing with massive levels of labor law violation. You might be able to get Walmart to back up on that in some sort of a non-bashing shame campaign. When you're talking about changing the Walmart model, most of which is legal, they're not going to change that through polite suasion. I mean, I've been on the mailing list for Walmart Watch for a long time. They're bashing them pretty hard over there. They're doing a lot of bashing, and it hasn't worked as of yet. And so I do think that raises this question of, where do the good jobs come from? What comes next? Because I don't know that we're going to be able to do that through sort of a national conversation. There's going to be, I think, as Harry says, there's going to have to be a reason people get paid a lot to do something. And maybe that reason is these jobs get unionized through some mechanisms that are at this moment somewhat more difficult to see but could arise. Or maybe it is that we move into new industries that right now we're not seeing, or that the productivity revolution that a lot of us have been waiting for from the internet jumps up and suddenly we're seeing a lot of actual jobs created as opposed to a lot of apps created, although I like apps. But I think there is this question that people have trouble coming up with an answer to, which is, okay, where does the next wave of good jobs come from? And what I'm excited about is that, Eugene, you have the answer.
Let's hear it.
I haven't said necessarily that I know where the good jobs come from. As I said, I'm definitely a believer in the I don't know School of Economics. I do think there are things we can do. For instance, I would definitely put more money into wage subsidies. I think we know how to do that. There's one group that's been largely forgotten. I'm very upset. I know many people in this room always praise this administration. This administration has not put much money into job subsidies. People count the Social Security tax break that we got and everybody got as a job subsidy, and it's really not much of one. They could have put much more money into expansions of something like their income credit. I'm in favor of one that particularly would go to the low wage. They're largely males, but they're single people who are left out of the welfare system and the support system altogether, unless they go to prison, in which case they can get $100,000 worth of guards in prisons. But they're left out altogether, and there are ways we could definitely shift money to them, particularly in times of recession. That's possible. What I'm less optimistic about is that we know how to regulate to force employers to pay people more. And in point of fact, I do think there's one area of regulation. It's very complex. I'm not quite sure how to do it. I do think we need a new type of antitrust policy, in the sense that I think we should have a new slogan, which is stockholders and workers of the world unite. Because stockholders haven't really done very well in the last 10 or 20 years either. And what's happening is the top managers in firms, and by the way, a lot of the senior workers in firms who are in unions, have often walked away with a lot of the money. They've done that in pension plans, particularly. They're doing it now in a bill in Congress which says, let's underfund our plans even more, because that's a revenue raiser, which protects the older workers who don't lose out, but it really screws the younger workers. I think we need to figure out a way to try to figure out how to stop managers from walking away with so much of the money, which I think comes about through a lot of interacting directorates, power at the top. I think there are things we've got to think. I don't know how exactly to do that. That's an area I would move to. But what I do think we can do immediately is work on these job subsidies. That's where I would actually put my focus.
So a question raised by the job subsidies point. Heidi, at the Economic Policy Institute, you guys talk a lot about the productivity wedge. Wherein there's been a significant diversion in productivity increases and worker wages, and we've seen a lot of those increases in what you would expect to be the broad-based income increases from rising productivity go to the top 1%. And to some degree, I wonder if the world Gene is painting here, not necessarily explicitly, but I've heard other people say it explicitly, is it if we think the underlying tectonic plates of the economy have moved towards a composition such that going forward sustainably, the economy is going to deliver much more to these sort of superstars at the top, to the top 1%, the top 1 or 2 or 3%, and that the way we're going to have a sustainable economy is that we are just going to, over time, tax more of that and deliver it back down to the bottom in wage subsidies. That the sustainable model is not so much good jobs, but redistribution from the best jobs. Is that, I mean, do you see another way? Do you see another way?
It's a piece of it, and we know over the last 30 years our tax and transfer system has actually become less progressive. So even just restoring it to where it was 30 years ago would be a step. But I do think there's a bunch of pre-market stuff we can do. I'm not as pessimistic that things like unionization couldn't make a huge difference. There's a 2007 study by Richard Freeman that shows that fully half of non-unionized private sector workers want to be in a union. There is a desire for unionization out there if we can get willing workers into a union. And this question of where are the good jobs coming from? I get this question a lot. I think it's a super interesting question, but in some ways, it suggests that we're going to be pulled out of this by some silver bullet industry, when I think it's more the silver bullet industry comes from broad-based growth. Like we get some innovation that's coming out of a strong economy. It sort of goes in that direction rather than us pulling out. When you look at BLS projections going forward, that I know Harry doesn't always love these projections, so you could push back against this, but they're the best, you know, there are BLS scientists, so let's go with what they're saying for now. In 2010, the latest time they did these projections, 69% of jobs in this country actually didn't require any education or vocational certificate beyond high school. 69%. That is decreasing over time, but much more slowly than what people think. So we are needing additional educational credentials, but the evolution is happening much more slowly. Their projections to 2020 say that in 2020, 68% of the jobs will not require a degree or vocational certificate beyond high school. So we are going to have, for the foreseeable future, the large swath of the jobs in this country actually aren't going to need a whole lot of education. They're going to be sort of at risk of being low-wage, low-quality jobs. And so I think we really have to think about how to get bargaining power to workers across the educational distribution. That really is the big obstacle that's in front of us, that I think that's the lever we really need to focus on.
Can I just make a question here? I just want to be clear that, yes, there has been some erosion in the middle class, but it's exaggerated by several factors. First place, we often concentrate on the male who used to work in manufacturing, and there have been replacement middle-class jobs. A lot of healthcare jobs, nurses and others, have come in and filled the middle. The other thing that happens is we often focus on cash wages. And another big issue, which is really not a topic here, but Ron Haskins brought this up briefly earlier, is healthcare. You know, the CBO projections, when they did their projections for what health reform would cost, they said the average worker, average family, would need about $22,000 a year to cover their health insurance and health costs per year. So you take a middle-class worker that's making $40,000. If some or another they've got that $22,000 covered, $15,000 through insurance and $7,000 through, if they've got that covered somehow, that adds a lot to their wages. So I just want to be a little bit careful about what we're saying about middle-class jobs. And a final piece of this, which gets into how we deal with the changing world, is part of what's happening is those middle-class jobs have gone abroad. You know, hundreds of millions of people that used to be in poverty across the world are no longer in poverty. That is not necessarily a bad thing, even though it does have implications at home, and we've put a lot of the burden upon certain people here in the United States. So I just want to be a little careful that we're not totally pessimistic about conflating what happened in the recession and its unemployment with sort of what's happening to the middle-class jobs over time.
I think all that's true. So if you take the recession out, and let's all say it'll take most of the rest of the decade to recover from the recession, we do have some sense of where the good-paying jobs are not all disappearing, and they're not all going to people in the top 1%, and they're not all even going to college graduates. The economy does generate, and by the way, I don't believe the BLS projections have a very good track record. Tony Carnevale projections at Georgetown have a much better record. He projects a much higher demand for education. So, but I think there are good-paying jobs that will come back. Healthcare will be the biggest driver of them, and all the healthcare-related health technician fields, X-ray tech and lab tech and phlebotomists, a lot of growth in those sectors, and technicians in other sectors, installation, maintenance, and repair workers in many different kinds of sectors. I think construction will come back, but not in the next year or two. This is not a permanent, we're not at a permanent status. At least a couple million jobs will probably come back in construction. I think there will be growth in manufacturing and the high-tech part of manufacturing. I think even in parts of the service sector, the IT sector, the financial services sector, even retail. There is a high end of retail that's much better than Walmart, although actually Walmart does much better than a lot of other parts of retail. So in many sectors of the economy, there's likely to be generation of high-wage jobs. However, and I think some people said in the last panel, if you don't have something beyond a high school diploma, you're mostly not going to get those jobs. And it does come back to skills, I think. The good jobs being created almost uniformly require something beyond high school, whether it's an associate's degree, a certificate, an apprenticeship, some skill certification. And by the way, if we had higher quality career and technical education in the high school level, the way the Germans have, high school would be more valued by employers. Right now, employers are very skeptical.
Yeah. And apprenticeships.
And apprenticeships. Employers are very skeptical that our high school graduates can do anything right on average. And therefore, they look for these post-secondary. It doesn't have to be that way in the world. It's the way the world is right now. But the only way people are going to get the good-paying jobs that the economy is going to produce is to come with a stronger skill set. And especially for the poor, the longer-term poor who, by and large, don't have these skills and don't have any credentials beyond high school, and I think that really holds them back.
Whenever I hear this, this idea, which obviously seems true, I always wonder, if everything went right, and nothing will, but if everything went right, what is the time frame on which employers begin to think that people with just a high school diploma can do something right, in which employers begin to think on which this skills gap begins to close? Because people invoke it a lot, but I always wonder, which problems are we trying to solve? It's good to solve the problems we're going to have in 2027. I would prefer to not have problems in 2027, but you do hear, particularly in the media, constantly you just hear people saying it's time to move and focus on skills. And when they say that, what time frame are they talking about?
That's mostly a long-run situation, but I would say even in the short run. And Kathy, you talked about people going to community college, getting these degrees, and not finding jobs. If you look at the numbers, the unemployment rates are much, much worse for people without those credentials than for people who have them. Yeah. Yes, there are some people who go to community college, get a certification, and can't get a job. But on average, those people do much better than the people without them. So I don't think that's a reason not to do these things. Now, Ezra, you're right. If you talk about the high school issue, I think the notion that high school doesn't teach kids what they need, is so deeply entrenched, it would take a long time to change the policies and practices and even longer to change the employer perceptions. And by the way, we can have an honest discussion about why that occurred. And I think a lot of the angst about what we used to call vocational education, that attracts people, and that's legitimate angst. Old-fashioned voc ed was pretty lousy, and it did track minority kids and poor kids away from college. It doesn't have to be that way either. You know, if you look at something like the career academies, high-quality career and technical education can send just as many people into the post-secondary education world as other tracks. So we'd have to make a lot of changes. But I think, you know, community college is where a lot of the action is. We send enormous numbers of people right now to community college who don't finish anything. If you look at the completion rates among people with Pell Grants, we've just poured a lot of money into Pell Grants, about $35 billion a year right now. The vast majority of people who go to college with Pell Grants don't finish anything. Even a certificate, even a short-term, that's scandalous. So I think if we focused on that, how can we, and there's a lot of things, you know, there is an enormous disconnect, I think, between our higher education institutions and the real-world economy. And a lot of people, you know, they get this. First of all, as I think Kathy said, people do get stuck in remediation and never finish. The remediation itself has to be better integrated, like the IBEST program in the state of Washington has to be better integrated with occupational training, what employers are looking for. But people go to college, community college, they get no career counseling whatsoever. They have no idea what the high demand fields are, where the good jobs are. And even when they do, the institutions don't have any incentive to be responsive to the economy. Community colleges get the same subsidy from the state if people take health tech or if they take basket weaving. And it's more expensive for them to provide health tech. What are they going to do? They're not going to expand. You hear the stories of people going to community college, lining up to get into these health tech classes, often low-income people, and not being able to get in because the community colleges don't expand capacity because it's not in their financial interest to do that. So I think there's things we can do at that level, at that middle skill level, at the community college level, that I think relatively quickly, you know, within 5 years, could have an impact, could improve completion rates, and could be more tied to where the good jobs in the economy are.
Let me again emphasize that apprenticeships may be another way to go. The complication often with sending people to schools is they do get training, but they get training for jobs that aren't there. Whereas if you can figure out how to subsidize or at least encourage employers will mainly, not always, some of them will cheat, but mainly will be hiring people to do what they want them to do. And the main way most of us learn is not in school, we learn on the job. We learn by doing. So if we can follow a little bit some of the practices in Germany, some other countries whom we should be studying, on things like apprenticeships, I think that's another way to go, as opposed to just thinking we're just going to keep throwing more money at education, which, by the way, unless it's a junior college level, which I think has been innovative. I mean, one of the big 21st century issues in government is that the providers are running away with the money. You know, that's particularly true in colleges and universities, you know, where we put all this amount of money into the schools, and the professors, no offense, Matt, are walking away with a lot of the money. Right? The money is not going necessarily to support the kids to come out with the types of degrees they need. No, so I think we need to figure out, I agree with you, Harry, but I think we need to figure out ways to engage the employers in this discussion.
I agree with that
and
completely.
Junior colleges, community colleges have done a better job of that than the universities.
That's right. No, I agree with that completely. And some of the apprenticeships can be aimed at high school kids. Some of them will be aimed at community colleges. If we're going to be honest about who has been on the anti-apprenticeship side, a lot of it has to do with union, non-union politics. And the unions have not always been supportive of expanding what we call apprenticeship, what legally gets called outside. And we might want to, you know, in a world where unions represent
we're going to look to Heidi to answer that.
In a world where unions represent less than 7% of the private sector, and I don't think that's going to change very quickly, apprenticeship is often going to mean in a non-union world, and how do we structure them and encourage them? Although I would encourage them in both sectors.
Yeah. I just want to make a meta comment, I think, that I do...
Excellent. We were getting too much into the real...
No, because I think this is... I'm actually out of my wheelhouse talking about apprenticeships and community college and stuff, but I think I get that there's a lot of stuff that we could do better on those. The reform should happen. I don't know that much, but I think we want to not make it seem like we're sitting in this panel in 2012 and we think that skills are the main problem. Like, the main problem here is the lack of demand for workers. It's true that we've seen the unemployment rate is much, much lower for workers with high levels of education, but we have seen the unemployment rate roughly double across. So it went from, you know, for people with an advanced degree, it went from 1.5% to 3%, whereas people with less than a college degree, it went from 10% to 20%. So we've seen that demand for workers erode across the board. the skills stuff, we want to think about how to set up our workforce to be smart. We always need to think about that. That's not the predominant problem right now. The predominant problem right now is lack of demand for work.
One question on this before you jump in here. Well, the thing that I worry about a lot is at what point does, and I agree with you that we are fundamentally in a demand-driven problem now, at what point does that become a skills problem? At what point do we have, the dreaded and horrible word hysteresis begins to kick in, and people who've been out of the labor force now for 2 years or 3 years, they become less employable than they were before. They lose their weak connections to the labor force. It becomes harder for them to have a job. And problems that were short-term and could have been fixed with short-term solutions become long-term. And now we have these more difficult, tougher long-term solutions?
I think it's less of an issue than what people think. So this idea of hysteresis rose in the 80s with persistent high unemployment in Europe. A lot of research is coming out now showing that really that was a demand problem. So I think that a lot of the idea of hysteresis, the research that built that theory has been undermined. And then also, if you just look around, think of the work that gets done in our country. You see the work that gets done? You have to actually rack your brain to come up with an occupation where if you're out for even 1 or 2 years, the world passes you by. You can come up with them, right? You can think of software programmers, whatever, but it's not most of the work that you see getting done. So I do think long-term unemployed people suffer through potential employers may take it as a sign somehow that it's their fault that they're not finding new work, or it can erode their networks. The skills erosion thing sort of sometimes feels like it doesn't really pass the common sense test.
It's less the skills erosion, I think, than the habit formation. I mean, the evidence, for instance, of when people get on disability is that often many of them become depressed. The impairments they have, which are often very legitimate, become more serious relative to everything else. And our ability, for instance, to get the disabled back to work is really, really bad in this country. And same way with unemployment, other things. We do get this habit formation. We don't design our unemployment and our disability programs to try to do early intervention to try to encourage people to get back to work. And employers I've talked to who have these various types of things for disabilities as opposed to the government disabilities say that one of the first things they do is they try to hire people to immediately contact the worker, get in touch with them and try to work with them. Now, if there's not a job, I understand that's hard, but we do have this short-term problem evolving into a longer term when we let people stay unemployed for long periods of time.
But we're focused too much. This whole discussion is fine. It's only about the recession. During the recession, I agree with you, Heidi. Okay. The recession is mostly a demand-driven problem and a shortage of jobs. There's no question about that. Cool. There's no credible analysis to say that. But that's not the only issue. We've had this growing inequality been growing for 30-plus years.
Yeah,
there are long-term trends. And what you call the skill stuff, I think the skill stuff for low-income people, when you look at their educational attainment, the fraction that don't finish high school, the fraction that start community college and don't finish it, the skill stuff matters a lot, and we got to keep focusing on the skill gaps and how to remedy them for this population. It's a hugely important part of it if we ever want any of those people to get the good quality jobs that I think the economy will generate to some extent.
I'm unfortunately going to jump back into the short-term recession question for me because, Sarita, I wanted to ask you about the geography of it. Because I think one thing that sometimes we talk a lot about aggregate unemployment statistics. We say we have 8.2% unemployment. We say we have this level of unemployment among college-educated workers. But, when you look at it, in North Dakota, I think you have negative 75% unemployment rate. I think everybody has 4 jobs, is my understanding. And when you look at Nevada, it is not that way. And we kind of work very hard in Washington, I think, to keep the idea very, very far from anybody's head that we are subsidizing particular states, right? We do not have a Nevada, Florida, interior California stimulus plan. Nobody would ever do that. I think we really try to make it seem, we really try to make national problems our problems appear to be national with national solutions. And so we end up not always spending money very effectively, but we also end up with a lot of people in these very, very, very hard-hit areas who are having trouble getting a job, not just because of skills, though that can be part of it as well, but in particular right now because around them there are no jobs. And they're not very mobile, they have deep family networks, sometimes they have a house underwater. What do we do for them? How do we bring the sort of the unusually geographic nature of this recession into our sort of thinking about solutions for it?
Great question.
I thought of it myself, actually.
Well, this is where I think local economy building becomes so important, and a lot of the work that many groups have been doing to really pay attention to what are the local, what are the jobs in the local economy? Where can there be growth in the local economy? How can we advocate for job creation? So having a much more localized view is important to complement the national sort of solutions that people are coming up with. And you know, it's different in different geographies, what's possible. And you know, there are folks out there who say it's definitely true, healthcare is a field, like the jobs aren't going anywhere. Or, you know, schools, the jobs aren't going anywhere. But there's a need to really sort of dissect and understand, again, what are sort of local, how do we rebuild local economies in a way that stimulates job growth, that allows people to have, you know, access to those jobs, skills, you know, training to access those jobs and then live a dignified life. It's interesting, as we're looking at this Caring Across Generations campaign, looking at this care economy question, this is coming up a lot, because in different parts of the country, depending on the age wave and depending on demographics, I mean, basically, we see more and more people who are being hired, for example, I'm talking about home-based care right now, to provide child care, but then suddenly are being asked to change catheters for elders in the home, or they're being asked to administer medications. So what we're trying to do is organize in a way where we're doing these local care congresses across the country, get people to come and tell their own care stories, but talk about what it means to be providing this kind of support. Often it can be family members, or it can be just individuals who are domestic workers. And how do we actually together think about how we're creating jobs in the community? These are home-based care jobs, but then really pulling apart the opportunities around that. And I think we have to do more of that in different sectors. I think we have to really dig in deep and think about local economy building in a meaningful way that runs across all the sectors. I just used the care example as one, but I think there's many others. I mean, even if, you know, even looking at retail or even looking at other sectors, you know, bringing folks together, small businesses with community members, to really think about the kinds of jobs that need to get created, where are the opportunities, and then what can we advocate for together at the state levels or at the federal level for resources that might be needed to support the kind of job growth. That's the kind of work we need to be doing right now.
I think it's very hard to do good economic development in really depressed, often rural areas. I just don't think we have good models, successful models for that. We do have some models of depressed metropolitan areas that lost their manufacturing base and have figured out how to come back. The most successful versions of those are the eds and meds, university hospitals, and that combination, and then you can figure out, and that has worked quite well in places like Cleveland, Pittsburgh,
sure,
you know, some other places, and then you can try to ensure that people in low-income communities have access, better access to both the skills and the jobs that are being created in those places. If you're talking about rural areas that are not near any metropolitan region, it's much tougher, and the long-term trend is really not very encouraging. But I think that the better success stories are at the metro level, and then trying to make that kind of development inclusive to all parts of the metro area.
I would also be sure, and this is only a small part of the solution to a more universal problem, but in fact the United States has typically done much better than Europe because we have a mobile labor force. That actually is one reason why a lot of the problems that Europe has, we don't have. But we could actually design our social welfare system so it does a much better job at allowing people to be mobile. Just as one example, I worked with Catholic Charities, who has a little experimental program that they've proposed, which basically says if low-income people are getting certain subsidies within their city or their state, let's figure out ways that the caseworker who's working with them and the worker or the individual who's not working can actually bargain towards some better solution towards solving their problem. Part of that solution might be that, you know, I'll take a little less in food stamps, I'll take a little more in education, or, you know, this rental subsidy really should be able to convert to an ownership subsidy, or maybe I should be able to take some of these subsidies and even move to another area. And we lock in a lot of our people who are within our social welfare structure where they've got this particular benefit. I mentioned the disabled earlier, but you know, you're in rental housing somewhere else, and the system is not really conducive to helping you move onward and find a better situation for yourself.
Before we move to Q&A here, I want to throw out one last question, and anybody who would like can take this, because I've actually not done a poll to figure out how much you all love to talk about monetary policy. But Congress, for all that we can talk about solutions here, is not super likely to do anything of any utility between now and ever, and which is depressing, but I think probably an accurate analysis. So there is the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
They do have, arguably, quite a lot of power. Ben Bernanke does have a working majority on his board. Do you guys think there are significant solutions at this point that could come from more unconventional monetary policy? Do you guys think that there are bullets left in the monetary policy gun?
This is not a group of monetary experts. So we're not, I mean, I think when you have essentially zero interest rates, there are probably a few bullets, but not many. And could we do better? Could Bernanke and my old teacher Janet Yellen do better? Probably a little better. I think they could be a little more aggressive on a few of those things. You could a little bit up the targeted rate of inflation or the targeted rate of nominal growth. But I think those effects would be more on the margin than game changers.
Yeah. I worry a lot about the fact that we're having these 0% interest rates. I think we've gone through a history of 50 to 100 years where we've decided to expand the economy mainly by providing more and more and more credit to the public. And basically we've done it in a way that's really penalized savers. And I know we haven't talked much about asset development here. That's not the topic. But you may remember the earlier statistic about a lot of the middle class falling back down to lower class. I think one reason for that is we're not measuring them correctly as being the middle class. They might have had middle class income, but they really don't have middle class wealth. They really don't have a lot of other middle class characteristics. And I've studied asset development for people who make it to the median. And what actually happens is they save $4,000, $8,000, $12,000 a year, even though they're only earning $40,000 or $50,000. You say, well, how's that happen? Well, it's basically they're paying off a mortgage, which if you think about it is saving several $1,000s a year, every year, partly because of inflation, partly because you're paying off the mortgage. And they typically get in some sort of pension plan. So I think there are things we could do now, but the monetary policy now doesn't encourage saving. Our pension policy doesn't encourage saving. And I think there are a lot of things we could do on that front, although just strictly speaking, just putting more money out, no, I don't think there's a lot of room there.
All right. All right. Let's do some Q&A. I imagine this works somehow with microphones, or does it? It does. There's a microphone. Somebody should raise their hand to signal that should come near to them so they could talk to it in an amplified way. I think somebody over there wants to ask a question. Over there? No? Yeah, mic people?
Oh, there's
All right. I don't think that mic is on. But it was a good joke we played on you.
Well, so I'll take a crack at that. And Maureen, you and I are both big believers in sectoral employment and training programs. So and whether that, and that's a kind of program where, and Gene, you talked about the employers, where you actively involve the employer and industry associations in the training of the workers, and they have a much better research track record for success, especially with the low-income population. So I think that's certainly a way to do that. Now, the provider can be community colleges, or it could be other providers, and we know that it's done. I don't think, if you want to do something at scale, to me, the community colleges seem like the right place. And by the way, in high schools, improving the quality of CTE programs in high schools seems to me the place to go where you can do these things at scale. And I agree with you that there's a lot of problems. You know, many community colleges don't view themselves. They view themselves as institutions of higher education that prepare people for the four-year colleges, not for the labor market. They're not all like that. And there's high variance in community colleges, as with everything else. I still think that's a big enough margin that you could do some good if you change things. Now, there are two other things you said that I want to address. First of all is this issue of the more general skills, the problem solving, the communication. And I agree with you, those things matter. They're not the only things that matter. I mean, before employers look for those things, they do look for the credential. The credential has to be there in most of these cases. And then they hire the people, and then they complain about, they can't solve problems and they can't communicate. Those things, I think, but part of the problem is I think we have focused too narrowly in education reform on test scores, achievement measured narrowly. Assessments on those other broader applied skills haven't been developed to the same extent, but I think they should. And I think we should develop better assessments that measure those important skills, not just the traditional reading and writing gaps, which are important too, but are far from the whole ballgame. Now, the other thing you said, Maureen, was in some sense, if we train all these people for all these jobs, you're basically saying, the supply is going to increase and it's going to dampen. I think there's enough strong demand in parts of those middle skill sectors that employers have at least some, not in this labor market, but when you're closer to kind of long-term trend, that you could absorb some significant increases in the supply of skilled workers without dramatically, dampening. There might be some. Look, it's true that if you increased the supply of workers, those skills, that the wage increases might. But the gaps right now are so large. You could do so much good by taking high school graduates and high school dropouts and giving them a meaningful certification in a high demand area, that to me, it's a no-brainer that we should be doing more of that, and the economic benefits would exceed the cost. Heidi?
I think the one thing just to add to this, I think it's sort of exactly what you just said, but you're absolutely right. For any individual who jumps from not having a college degree to having a college degree, that individual takes a huge pay increase on average. But this whole question of, are we getting, I don't want to say too many, but one way that we would see if we needed more college graduates is you see the wages of college graduates rising to draw more people in. We are not actually seeing that. The wages of college graduates have been flat since 2000. If you're looking at people with just a BA, if you add in people with advanced degrees, they've risen a little bit. But if you look at the average wages of people with just a BA, no growth since 2000. So it is there are these questions of for any individual, it's absolutely if I were talking to a 16-year-old, I would be go to college. You will have better outcomes in your lifetime. But when you're thinking about what to do policy-wise, that's where I come back to that. Man, we just need to get good wages to people across the income distribution.
But the problem with that, of course, it's true. I mean, the labor market since the year 2000 was more or less lousy for everybody, except for the very top 1%. And there's other things to do to address that. But the gap between people that have college certificates versus those who do not has never been higher in our economy. It rose dramatically between about 1975 and the year 2000. And even policy-wise, if we could somehow increase by 5 or 10 percentage points the fraction of low-income people that have those credentials, they would not only be massively better off, but I think the economy would have much less inequality than it has today. And the 10 years of flatness notwithstanding, there's still huge gaps between people that have the credentials and those that could be better exploited.
All right.
Hello. A lot of the young men, as a school teacher, who drop out of school are pretty smart. Schools are pretty boring, and there's not much there for young men, really. I hate to say that. But anyway.
Well, they're young girls.
Or girls.
School, it was.
Yeah, girls too. But young men are very bright. They may not read so well, but they can get into your car and take off your inspection sticker and sell it. They're not stupid. Going to what you're talking about, a large co-op in Southwest. It's a multi-million-dollar co-op, justices, Supreme Court, congressmen, da-da. We got rid of our Hispanic unionized janitorial staff because they were too expensive. Okay, so then we hired these wonderful young people from El Salvador without papers and no health insurance because they were inexpensive. Now, and they cleaned too clean. It was really, I used to say, it doesn't have to be that clean. You don't dare walk on the floor. It looks like ice. And I learned Spanish from them. Now, we got rid of them because we got another unpapered workers who are cheaper. So, and we have public housing a block away and single mothers who could be health aides. But guess what? The health aides come in for the elderly people who live there from Gaithersburg. So now I'm asking all you talking heads and all you educated people, and what a city we have with enormous amount of ideas. What can we do?
What can we do?
Well, I want to address one piece of what you said that I think is very important, and Gene and I have touched on it briefly, and a few people earlier panel. What has happened to less educated young men in this country? Now, again, Heidi will probably slap my wrist and say women too, and I agree with you, but less educated men who used to be able to find good jobs in the blue-collar sector and in production work have really taken a huge beating. And I think several people in the first panel alluded to this. When they're in their adolescent years and their early high school years, they look down the pike. Whether they graduate from high school, they don't see anything for themselves, and it encourages them to disconnect from the whole mainstream world, disconnect from the world of education, from the world of work, from the world of marriage. If you plot what's happened to the wages of less skilled men, and you plot what's happened to marriage rates, they correlate very strongly, and I think some of that's causal. So I think part of what we have to do is show these young boys early in life that there is something for them. But it does mean pretty big changes in the education system, in the workforce system. It means rebuilding good quality career and technical education, better linked to what employers are looking for in the economy, and then helping those young boys see that there is some future for them. And of course, once they get out of school, doing more to help them get those jobs. And if they get a low-wage job, as Gene said before, they deserve an earned income tax credit too. To bolster, the earned income tax credit has been a fabulous success story, mostly for low-income moms with 2 or more kids. There's a lot of low-income adults who have been left out of that story. A lot of these low-wage men who might be incented to take an $8 or $10 an hour job if it could be better enhanced by EITC and those kinds of supports.
I just want to add this footnote on the education side of this is the way our school system is structured. In fact, this emphasis on going to college tells the median or below median student, often you're a failure. You're the C. What incentive is there if you're a C- student to get a C or even be the B student? You can rise up and be mediocre. The system is not designed to reward with positive reinforcement the people who are not necessarily going to be above median. And quite honestly, I'm going to surprise some people here, but half of all students are going to be below median. And so we need reward structures that are going to help them. And part of that is that you can go on different paths to careers. You take advantage of what relative skills they do have, and you really try to encourage them. But we could get off into a whole discussion of educational sector as well, which has to be a major part of this issue.
Excuse me, sir.
Against young black men, let's face it. White people are scared of them.
Sarita, I want to check your math on the median thing later, but Sarita, I wanted to ask, how do you prevent, because you've spoken a lot about care jobs here, how do you prevent a race to the bottom in them?
Well, exactly. This is what I was just about to say. I wanted to go meta for a second. I think exactly what you're describing is what we see happening all over the US and around the world, frankly. And at some point, we have to decide we're going to stop this race to the bottom. And look, we have to stop acting like the economy just does and the markets just do. We actually have the ability to shape the market. We actually have the ability to put our values back on the table and shape the economy according to our values. If we believe that the purpose of the economy is to actually ensure that people can work, have access to jobs, and live a dignified life, then why are we not pushing policy? Why are we not pushing forward an agenda, a visionary agenda, an aspirational agenda that actually says what is in play now isn't working for the majority of the people in this country? And if we're serious about dealing with inequality in this country, then we fundamentally need to shift how our economy functions. And that requires organizing, that requires talking in communities. But frankly, people, let's be honest, that our political system is such a mess that the average person feels completely disconnected from our democracy. Our democracy is broken, and people know it. Everyone knows it. So the question becomes, are we as progressives in this country, are we as people in this country actually going to say enough is enough? Let's create the space for people to actually feel connected to their democracy and actually shape the kind of economy that they want and the kind of jobs that they need. That's what we need more of right now. We're not going to break this gridlock by just talking about, like, we have to organize people differently. People have to actually, you know, change. The civil rights movement didn't just happen. It happened because people struggled and organized and said enough is enough and had hope and vision. And this discussion's been a little depressing because I feel like we haven't actually brought the heart into this conversation at all. We've been very heady, and that's okay. I'm all for it in this space. But we're talking about people's lives. These are people's livelihoods. We don't want to fall into the trap of saying it's okay that unemployment stays at the rate it's at, whether it's a recession or not. We have to, like, remember we're talking about people's livelihoods here. And so how do we put that front and center again as we push forward a real economic policy agenda in this country and just a political agenda in this country? That's what we need right now.
Whatever I do next will bring this in a much more depressing direction. So I'm actually going to say we are out of time, which happens to be true, which is very lucky for me. And thank you to Sarita, to Heidi, to Harry, and to Eugene. Great panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sarita, for encouraging us to bring the heart back into this room. Very well said. It's lunchtime. Lunch is out there. It's self-serve. Please meet each other, talk. I know there's a lot of interesting people in this room, but please try and come back by 12:20 so that we can have a great discussion about the austerity debate. 12:20.